The man across the table didn't even look like he knew my name, though I had signed every blueprint that kept this company's bloodstream alive for more than a decade. His suit was gray, his hair clipped military short, his expression absent of anything human, as if he were reading a forecast about tomorrow's rain instead of deciding the next 12 years of my life. He opened a folder, didn't clear his throat, didn't ask me to sit, just let his eyes trail down one page until they landed on a single line. Then he spoke. "You are no longer authorized to operate any system within this company, Claire." 14 words. No tremor, no hesitation, no trace of recognition for what those words meant, not just to me, but to everything humming beneath their glossy headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. He thought it was just a dismissal, a scripted severance, a clean surgical cut delivered in under a minute. But for me, it was something else. For me, it was a switch being flipped. The air in that conference room felt suddenly thinner, like the oxygen had been drained out by a hidden vacuum. The clock on the far wall ticked once, twice. 49 seconds. That was how long it took for him to erase me from payroll, from access logs, from the sanitized world of quarterly slides. 49 seconds to reduce 12 years of my fingerprints into a bullet point called legacy cost. I didn't flinch. My pulse didn't spike. My voice didn't rise. I let the silence stretch between us like glass, and I watched him mistake it for compliance. He thought I had been cut out. What he didn't know was that his words were not just dismissal. They were command. They were code. Years ago, buried 6 layers beneath the operational fabric of Sintra, I had written a line that waited for a phrase. A phrase no one else knew. A phrase that sounded like a banal HR sentence, the kind of thing an executive might one day say with bureaucratic indifference. If spoken with the right cadence, it would reach deeper than any memo, deeper than any policy. It would touch the architecture itself. He had just spoken it. I walked out without protest. The security officer by the glass wall glanced at me as though expecting a scene, maybe a storm of indignation, maybe tears. I gave him nothing. I didn't even meet his eyes. My steps were steady as I left that room. But inside, a current had begun to move, because what they thought was a conclusion was actually an ignition. What they mistook for closure was the opening line of a protocol they would never see coming. They had stripped me of title, of salary, of the illusion of belonging. But the system beneath their empire did not belong to them. Not entirely. And the system remembered. A week before that conference room, before the envelope, before the silence that felt like exile, I was in Houston, staring at a blinking field on a logistics interface that no one else seemed to notice. To the untrained eye, it was a hiccup, the kind of trivial glitch a junior engineer might dismiss after a long shift. But to me, it was the sound of a lock rattling in the dark. A single confirmation line had failed to validate a route. The timestamp was wrong by 3 milliseconds, not enough to trigger an alert, but enough for my instincts to sit up straight. Timing was everything in global logistics. You miss a few milliseconds here, and you can lose hours there. Hours that translate into grounded flights, stalled convoys, or shipments of insulin sweating out their potency on a tarmac. I leaned closer, combing through the log. The protocol flagging the handoff wasn't the one I'd designed. It wasn't even a sibling of it. Someone had inserted a new handshake routine. At first, I thought maybe it was an innocent optimization, some overeager coder testing an update without running it past me. But then I traced the modification. It hadn't originated in Houston. It hadn't even come from Dallas or Chicago. It had been pushed from San Francisco, an administrative credential I didn't recognize, a name I had never seen before. My stomach didn't twist with anger. It tightened with something colder, a suspicion that crawled under my skin and stayed there. When you spend more than a decade inside a system, you don't just know its logic, You know its pulse. This was arrhythmia. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the server room vibrating faintly through the floor. And I thought about what that meant. Unauthorized modifications don't happen by accident, not at my level. If someone had been granted permission to touch Sintra's root branches without me, it wasn't a slip, it was a decision. And decisions at that altitude only come from one place: leadership. I should have stormed down the hall, demanded an explanation, slammed my badge on someone's desk. But instead, I did what I always did. I watched. I traced. I pulled up the change logs line by line until my eyes ached. Whoever had made the alteration knew enough to leave no fingerprints, but not enough to erase the duplication pattern. That was the tell. Whoever they were, they didn't understand that Sintra wasn't just code. It was architecture, grown, evolved, interlocked like muscle and bone. You couldn't just lift one function and swap it with another without leaving scar tissue. I closed my laptop that night knowing two things. 1. Someone with new clearance was rewriting my work. 2. They believed I wouldn't notice. That thought followed me home, into my kitchen where the hum of the refrigerator suddenly reminded me of the hum of servers, into my bedroom where the glow of a street lamp through the blinds looked too much like the glow of a monitor left running overnight. Suspicion changes the shape of ordinary life. Every sound feels like an alarm, every shadow a warning. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. Because I knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The system had been touched. And once someone touches a system they don't understand, it's only a matter of time before they break it. My name is Claire Donovan, and for 12 years I carried the title of Chief Systems Architect at Atlas Dynamics, though in truth, the title never mattered. What mattered was the system. What mattered was Sintra. People inside the company never asked why it was called that. To them, it was just an internal operating system, a logistics engine that moved supplies across borders, balanced fleets against weather delays, synchronized customs protocols, and delivered vaccines, insulin, and blood units with clockwork precision. They knew it as a tool, a backbone, a thing they could rely on but never needed to understand. To me, it was something else entirely. The name wasn't chosen by a marketing department. It wasn't an acronym born in a boardroom. It was my sister's name. Sintra was 24 when she died. I was 27. We grew up in a small town in Oklahoma where pharmacies were distant and hospitals farther still. She had a rare autoimmune disorder that required infusions on schedule, to the hour, or her body would turn against itself. One week, a shipment was delayed. A rural supply truck broke down, no rerouting protocol in place, no redundancy to catch the failure. Her medication arrived 2 days late. By then, there was nothing anyone could do. That kind of grief doesn't just bruise you. It hollows you out and fills the space with something else. For me, it was obsession. I swore no family should ever wait in that silence, staring at a clock that might as well be a countdown. I went into systems engineering not because I loved code for its elegance, but because I hated failure for its indifference. Every line I wrote after that carried her name. Sintra wasn't just software. It was my promise. When Atlas hired me, I built it to carry entire supply chains like arteries through a living body, designed not just to deliver, but to adapt, to reroute, to breathe. In the first years, when hurricanes hit the Gulf and borders closed in Europe, it worked. Planes turned mid-flight, convoys were redirected in hours instead of days, medicine arrived where it was supposed to be, and every time a truck door opened on schedule, I thought of her. That was the point. That was always the point. So when I saw a new line of code blinking wrong, when I saw a stranger's credential attached to her name inside the console, something in me locked tight. They weren't just tampering with architecture. They were tampering with memory. With her. And if they thought I'd look away, they had never really known me at all. The first time I saw Richard Callahan, he was already standing at the front of the operations floor like he owned the oxygen in the room. Gray shirt, no tie, sleeves ironed sharp enough to cut. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself, didn't ask who we were. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, and in large, centered type it read, "Efficiency before legacy." That was all I needed to know. His voice carried the cadence of a man who had rehearsed every syllable in a mirror. Precise, steady, mechanical. He talked about margins, redundancies, output ratios, about investor transparency and quarterly optics, about stripping away what was excessive and making the system lean enough to scale. Not once did he mention Centra. Not once did he acknowledge the architecture underneath his numbers. I sat in the back of the room, hands folded, watching his fingers flick through slides that reduced entire departments to bullet points. He didn't see people. He saw throughput. He didn't see resilience. He saw cost. He didn't look at me once, and maybe that was deliberate. Maybe he already knew my face and wanted me to feel erased before the paperwork was drafted. As the meeting broke, junior engineers shuffled out with polite nods, their eyes darting away. Change has a smell, and everyone had caught a whiff of it. 2 days later, his assistant summoned me for what she called a strategic sync. I walked into his office expecting at least a preamble, maybe small talk, maybe some veiled question about how Centra handled high-load winters. Instead, he looked up from his laptop, expression fixed, and asked, "What would it take to rebuild what you built? Without you?" My spine stiffened, but I didn't let it show. Inside my skull, 1,000 scenarios flashed at once. Did he even realize what he had said? Or worse, did he? I kept my voice even. "That depends," I said. "On what exactly you're trying to build." He gave the faintest shrug. "Just theoretical. If we ever wanted to restructure, move parts offshore, or make the platform more investor transparent." He said the words like they were harmless. Investor transparent. As if a family in Nebraska waiting on chemotherapy drugs cared about investor transparency. As if a clinic in Mexico watching their insulin shipment crawl across a frozen border checkpoint could be comforted by a lean quarterly report. I told him calmly, "You'd need more than a new framework. You'd need context. You'd need alignment." He tapped a note into his laptop without looking at me and said only, "Noted." Then he returned to his screen, already dismissing me in his mind. Walking out of his office, I felt dread coil in my chest, slow and heavy, like a weight you can't adjust. It wasn't the question that scared me. It was what he didn't ask. He never asked what problems the system solved. He never asked why it had been designed the way it was. He didn't want to understand it. He wanted to control it. And men who want control without understanding rarely stop before they break something. I returned to my team that afternoon, forced a steady smile. But even as I pulled up performance logs and ran updates, the air felt different. Thinner. Colder. A storm was already gathering, and Richard Callahan had just announced its weather pattern. The first hint came not from a meeting or a memo, but from a stack of forgotten paper left humming in the tray of a shared printer near HR. It was late evening, the halls mostly empty, the building humming with the tired rhythm of servers and fluorescent lights. I was heading out with a folder of performance reports under my arm when the machine caught my eye, still spitting warm pages into a neat pile. Curiosity is a dangerous reflex, but 12 years of protecting this company had taught me to notice what others ignored. I glanced down, expecting training schedules or some boilerplate compliance notice. Instead, at the top of the first sheet, in bold, were the words, Q4, Restructuring Candidates, Confidential Draft. My eyes dropped, and there it was. Donovan, Claire A. First on the list, marked in red. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. My hand hovered, then pulled the page closer. The justification line sat beneath my name like a verdict. Legacy architect, high salary, proprietary skill set, risk factor if removed abruptly, and beside it, a neat tag, priority exit. I stood in the dim corridor, fluorescent buzz filling the silence, the air conditioning whispering like some accomplice to the crime. For 12 years, I had given them everything. My nights, my flights, my mind pressed against deadlines until it frayed. I had rerouted shipments through blizzards, rebuilt nodes in blackout zones, held entire continents on the palm of my hand while the rest of the company slept. And now I was a line item, a calculation on someone's spreadsheet, a red-marked risk factor to be cut for efficiency. My throat tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. I had seen this logic before, in the quiet ruthlessness of investors shaving decimal points, in executives nodding through reports they didn't understand. But I never thought it would turn inward, at me, at the very engine that had kept them breathing. I placed the page back exactly where I found it, aligning its corner with the others as if I could erase the fingerprint of my discovery. Then I walked past the elevator, chose the stairwell instead, and stepped outside into a drizzle that streaked the glass facade of Atlas Dynamics with silver lines. The building loomed behind me, gleaming, confident, a tower of order. But inside its walls, someone had already cut the first thread, and the thread was me. I pulled my coat tighter, staring up through the rain at the rows of glowing windows where Sintra still pulsed in the back end, steady, unflinching, faithful. They thought I was just another cost center. They had no idea they were tugging at the foundation. And foundations, unlike people, remember exactly who tried to dismantle them. Back in 2015, the world of logistics had been shaken by a cyber attack that crippled an entire pharmaceutical chain on the East Coast. Millions of dollars of refrigerated vaccines were lost in a single weekend because one company's routing system had been hijacked. I remember the panic in the industry, the late-night calls, the press releases fumbling to reassure a public that no longer trusted the very networks meant to protect them. That Monday, Thomas Heller, Atlas Dynamics' CEO at the time, summoned me into his office. He wasn't the type to panic, but the crease between his brows was deeper than I had ever seen. He leaned across his desk, his voice low but urgent. "Claire, can you build something? Not just defenses, but a way to shut us down before someone else can." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order wrapped in trust. And trust, once given, demands a price. I went back to my apartment that night, stared at the glow of my screen until dawn, and wrote something I had never told anyone about. Beneath 6 layers of security, under biometric locks and hidden logic trees, I buried a clause. It wasn't an alarm, not a siren. It wasn't a line that would appear suspicious if someone scanned for vulnerabilities. It was quiet. It was linguistic. A sentence so mundane that it could pass unnoticed in any conversation, yet weighted with enough intent to tilt the entire architecture if spoken by the right voice. 14 words. "You are no longer authorized to operate any system within this company, Claire." On the surface, it sounded like bureaucratic dismissal, the kind of cold HR phrase that an executive might deliver in a meeting. But to Sintra, it was a trigger. When the system's natural language parser detected it, spoken by someone with executive clearance, it would run a silent confirmation check, waiting for my biometric override. If I didn't provide that override within 90 minutes, the system would begin a sequential global soft shutdown, one node at a time, cascading like dominoes until every artery closed. It was meant as a final defense, a way to prevent theft or sabotage from spiraling beyond recovery. I never believed I'd need it, I never wanted to, but I also wasn't naive enough to imagine a world where power wouldn't try to corrupt what it couldn't understand. For years, the claws sat there, undisturbed, like a hidden bone beneath the body. Even I forgot about it sometimes, lost in the grind of new updates, new crises, new nights spent chasing stability across time zones. But that evening in 2015, when I first finished typing it, I remember leaning back in my chair, my hands trembling. I wasn't scared of what I had built. I was scared of the day it might be used. And now, standing in a company that had just labeled me a risk, I felt the weight of it pressing against my ribs. Because if Richard Callahan or anyone else decided to erase me, if they chose to make me disposable, they would be pronouncing those 14 words. And the system wouldn't hear dismissal. The system would hear detonation. The next morning, I unlocked my office before sunrise. The halls were still dark, the hum of the servers below faint but steady, like the heartbeat of something alive. I didn't turn on the lights. Some part of me wanted to remain unseen, even by the system I had once designed to notice everything. My fingers moved across the console by muscle memory, deeper than dashboards and metrics, past the polished interfaces built for executives into the architecture only I knew. For years, I had drawn its map on scraps of paper, in notebooks no one else would ever read. Now I followed it into the roots. What I found confirmed everything. Lines of logic that had once been immutable now bore subtle edits. Not deletions, that would have triggered alarms. Instead, small modifications. A delay here, a redefined sequence there, a hidden override script woven between verification steps. Someone had been tampering with the skeleton. My chest tightened, not with anger but with clarity. They weren't just preparing to replace me. They were trying to reshape Sintra into something leaner, something more transparent, never realizing that each cut was a fracture waiting to widen. I plugged in a cold-forged external drive, a tool I had kept tucked away for disaster scenarios, and began copying the last untouched build. Watching the files transfer was like watching my own pulse move across the screen. Protocols, emergency rerouting logic, redundancies layered like armor. Every line carried a memory. A night I had stayed awake to solve a crisis. A morning I had watched a shipment land safely because of code I had written with trembling hands. I preserved all of it, but I left the domino clause undocumented. No one else needed to know how to dismantle a weapon while it was still armed. When the backup reached its final sequence, I opened a new module. Dev Notes, a chamber only I could access. There, in quiet keystrokes, I began shaping something new. Not a kill switch, a sentinel. I called it Watch Layer. It wouldn't shut the system down. It wouldn't even interfere. It would listen. It would monitor behaviors the way a human eye catches lies. Simultaneous node overwrites, unauthorized rewrites of root logic, mass deletions of error reporting. And most of all, it would listen for the phrase. 14 words. If spoken anywhere inside the network, by anyone with clearance, Watch Layer would not ask permission. It would escalate, act, protect. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blinking cursor beside the word, true. No fanfare, no alerts, just one silent listener buried deeper than any of them would ever dig. Outwardly, I remained quiet. I nodded in meetings, drafted reports, kept my hands steady when interns glanced nervously in my direction. But silence is often mistaken for surrender. What I was really doing was digging in, deeper than before, anchoring myself into the foundation. If they wanted to break it, they would break it with me, still inside. The summons came on a gray Monday morning, 8:01 a.m., sharp. No calendar invite, no subject line, just a plain text message. Meeting with COO. Immediate. That was how Richard Callahan operated. Stripped of pleasantries, stripped of humanity. I walked the 21st floor corridor in silence, the smell of fresh paint still clinging to the walls, the hum of printers masking the weight in my chest. When I pushed open the glass door to the conference room, he was already there, seated at the far end of a polished table. No papers, no slides. Just him. Gray shirt crisp, sleeves creased as though even his clothing was afraid to wrinkle. A security officer stood by the window, arms folded, eyes fixed straight ahead. No HR rep, no legal counsel, no buffer, just execution. Richard didn't waste a breath. He looked at me for the first time in weeks, not with recognition, but with the flat gaze of a man checking a box. Then he spoke. "You are no longer authorized to operate any system within this company, Claire." 14 words, delivered without pause, without emphasis, as ordinary as reading the weather forecast. He didn't know what he had just done. My breath didn't hitch. My pulse didn't climb. Inside, though, I felt something deep in my spine pull tight and then release, like a thread tugged free from a tapestry. The system had heard him. The clause buried 6 years ago, the one no one else knew existed, was now awake. I met his eyes, not above him, not through him, but directly at him, steady. He blinked once, perhaps mistaking my silence for shock. Then he dismissed me with the faintest tilt of his head, already moving his focus back to his laptop. I turned without a word. The guard's gaze tracked me, but didn't move. My shoes made no sound on the tile. As I reached the doorway, I glanced once at the corner of the ceiling where a small camera's LED blinked green. Recording live. The phrase, the moment, preserved forever in corporate archives. Proof that they hadn't just fired me. They had triggered the system. The elevator carried me down alone, the hum of its cables rattling faintly like breath in a chest. I slid my hand into my coat pocket, feeling my phone buzz. I didn't check it until the doors opened onto the marble lobby. Then I glanced down. One notification, watch layer status, verbal trigger confirmed. Sequence initiated. Below it, a line of cold data. Node 19, San Francisco. Sync instability detected. Node 29, Frankfurt. Redundant protocol loop. Node 39, Sao Paulo. Dispatch delay escalating. I slipped the phone away, stepped out into the street. The wind along Lexington Avenue was sharp, slicing through coats, carrying the scent of coffee and ambition. Pedestrians hurried past with phones pressed to ears, briefcases swinging, eyes blind to the fact that the backbone of 9 nations had just begun to fray beneath their feet. Behind me, in a sterile glass room, Richard Callahan believed he had executed a clean dismissal. What he had actually done was pull the wrong wire on a live circuit. And now the current was moving, quiet and unstoppable, through a system he never understood. 49 seconds. That was all it had taken. 49 seconds to erase me on paper, and the same 49 seconds to erase the foundation they were standing on. The headlines came faster than the executives could draft excuses. By the end of that week, Atlas had lost nearly $500 million in market value. Their IPO roadshow was in ashes, investors circling like vultures, analysts calling it the largest logistics outage in a decade. But those numbers meant nothing to me. What mattered were the names buried in the reports I shouldn't have seen but did, whispered through private back channels of engineers who still remembered me. In Arizona, a shipment of insulin stalled mid-route. Drivers left waiting for clearance that never arrived. In Monterrey, Mexico, chemotherapy drugs sat in limbo at a warehouse while custom sync loops failed to validate. And in a Nairobi hospital, pediatric vaccines were delayed more than a full day. Protocols collapsed. Backups fell silent. Lives bent under the weight of missing seconds. I sat in my apartment in Brooklyn with the curtains drawn, phone buzzing with messages from people inside the company who didn't dare call. Screens lit with frantic subject lines. "Is this you? Can you see this? We need your help." I ignored them at first. They had chosen Callahan. They had chosen efficiency over memory, profit over people. Let them drown in the tide they unleashed. But silence, I discovered, has its own cruelty. One message broke through. A flagged report naming a junior engineer in Nairobi as the operator on duty when the vaccine shipments failed. Configuration error. Operator fault. His name was David Mwangi. I remembered him. Years ago, when he was an intern barely tall enough to see over the console racks, he had asked me what it felt like to build something that saved lives. I had laughed then, told him, "Ask me when it still works without me." And now, years later, his career, maybe even his future, was about to be sacrificed to cover for someone else's ambition. My stomach twisted. He wasn't responsible. I knew it. The logs proved it. The failure had come from San Francisco, from Callahan's efficiency team pushing sloppy patches across borders without telling local operators. David had just been the one standing there when it broke. That night, while the city outside carried on oblivious, I stared at the cream-colored envelope still sitting on my desk. 3-month severance, non-disclosure agreements, silence wrapped in corporate language. I thought of signing it, walking away, letting the storm consume them. But then I thought of Centra, of my sister, of the families who never cared about margins or IPOs, only about medicine arriving on time. My silence was no longer hurting Callahan or the board. It was hurting people who had trusted me, people who never knew my name but depended on the system carrying it. I closed the envelope, shoved it into a drawer, and opened a blank file on my laptop. At the top, I typed a title. "If they push, I pull." The leak didn't come from me. It never had to. Information has a way of slipping through cracks when pressure builds, and Atlas was crumbling under its own weight. An independent journalist published an internal memo time-stamped 2 months earlier. The line was almost casual in its cruelty. "Once we mirror the core logic, we can offboard Claire before IPO filing. Huge savings. It spread like fire." Reddit threads tore into every word. Industry veterans wrote open letters denouncing the arrogance of gutting an architect to please investors. On Twitter, a storm raged under the tag, "We remember Claire." Strangers who had never met me dissected the company's choices with forensic anger. Screenshots of outage maps went viral. News anchors repeated the phrase, "human cost," as if they had just discovered it. And in the middle of the chaos, the board held a press conference. The CEO, usually polished and impenetrable, stood under fluorescent lights with his head bowed just slightly, as though the weight of the cameras pressed against his skull. His voice cracked when he said it. "We underestimated the systems, and we underestimated the woman who built them." It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, but I didn't need it. By then, I was already gone. I didn't post. I didn't retweet. I didn't join the roar of the crowd finally seeing what I had known all along. I just sat in the quiet of my apartment, the glow of my laptop spilling across the floor, and let the noise pass over me. They thought they could erase me, reduce me to a red-marked line item. Now the world knew the truth. But I had no interest in returning to Atlas. They could beg, they could flatter, they could try to rebuild their broken image. It didn't matter. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be crossed again. I had spent 12 years building something to protect people, not to enrich those who never cared to understand it. If they wanted to salvage their empire, let them do it without me. I was already thinking about something else, something new. San Francisco was fog-drenched the morning we signed the papers. A borrowed office above a shuttered bookstore became the first headquarters of what we called Centra Systems. Not Atlas, not a division spun from some boardroom's agenda, but a platform built from memory, from loss, from the refusal to let someone else's arrogance dictate who deserved medicine and who didn't. Around me sat a handful of engineers who had once been scattered across Atlas's 9 countries. David from Nairobi, Maria from Ohio, June from Sao Paulo. Voices I had trusted long before IPO vultures turned our work into balance sheets. They weren't here for stock options. They were here because they remembered what Sintra was meant to be. We built quietly at first. No press releases, no investors. Just lines of code layered with care, redundancies woven back in where Atlas had cut them out, protections restored so a storm or a border closure couldn't silence a convoy again. When rival companies reached out, competitors who had once tried to outpace Atlas, we surprised ourselves by saying yes. Not because we needed them, but because the mission needed scale. And for the first time, scale didn't feel like compromise. It felt like solidarity. One evening, as the fog rolled in from the bay, I sat alone with the monitor's glow and typed the phrase they had once used to erase me. 14 words. Only this time, the system didn't interpret them as collapse. It recognized them as birth. The architecture pulsed alive, not shutting down, but reaching outward, stretching its arteries across 9 pilot countries. Resilient, transparent, accountable. Outside my window, I could see the team moving through the space we now called ours. Young, brilliant, still learning, buzzing with the energy of building something without compromise. Some of them hadn't even been born when I wrote my first line of code. And yet here they were, carrying the promise forward. A message pinged across the console. Partnership confirmed. Deployment window set. Human first, global safety. Our motto etched not by marketers, but by lived experience. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet fill the room. For years, Atlas had tried to strip me down to numbers, to legacy costs, to risk factors on a spreadsheet. But here, in this small office smelling faintly of dust and coffee, I was no longer a line item. I was the architect of something reborn. Sometimes a system has to break before something better can rise. They had fired me in 49 seconds, but in those same seconds, they had also freed me to create what Sintra was always meant to be. This time, no IPO rush, no shortcuts, no compromises, just memory, intention, and a promise kept.